Corey Shockey, the Deputy Director General of this outfit, the IISS. I am super glad all of you came today because we are we need your help thinking through a really hard problem, which is who innovates well, how to understand the metrics of innovation. I was in Washington on Friday because General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, pulled together a day-long offsite for his team. And I had the fun of running the conversation on this question, which is, what should you guys be worried about that you are not worried enough about? And we have two terrific experts to help us think through the piece of the problem that is innovation, because none of us are worried enough about being out-innovated. I have asked wonderful Ben Barry and Greg Malandrino, two folks with military experience who spend a lot of time thinking about what constitutes innovation, who's good at it, and how do we get better at it. And so that is where we are going to start this conversation today. Please consider it a conversation. Pile in on them if they give you an unsatisfactory answer. Pile in on me if I'm asking questions that are not as interesting as the questions you have to ask. Because my favorite thing about the International Institute for Strategic Studies is the sharp-edged quality of our intellectual engagement on hard problems. And so that's what we are up to today. I'm going to ask the two of you guys to start by defining innovation. What constitutes it for you?
It's change in the military. And of course, militaries are, when they're on operations, they're trying to outcompete the bad guys and change better than they can. And I think the best way to think of it is a three-legged stool. One leg is innovation, which I describe as change in peace that anticipates future conflict.
Excuse me, defining innovation was the question. So is that your definition of innovation?
But you do need to see the other two legs of the stool, one of which is adaptation, which is change in conflict to improve your chances of success. And both of these need a third leg, which is learning lessons from your operations and your training, and also what other people are doing.
I subscribe to parts of Ben's definition as well. I think there's anytime we talk about innovation specifically as it relates to militaries, it's very easy and is also kind of a fault specifically, in my opinion, of the U.S. military. We default to what we're good at and how we look at the world, and that's through a very technological and technical sense. So innovation as a subject, when described, most likely very quickly goes to what technology can we field to achieve some sort of advantage over our adversary. And while that's important, and we need to address that, and I hope to share some opinions with you guys today and also kind of move that issue forward through our discussion, I think it's also important to address that there's a very human aspect to it, and the National Defense Strategy recently released, and also the U.S. Navy CNO points for how the Navy can support the 2018 National Defense Strategy. It does mention the fact that people are also important. And not people in a force structure, just a numbers sense, but philosophically the manner in which that they are empowered to question existing assumptions, because innovation is impossible. If all we do is agree that everything's fine, then there's no impetus for innovation. So I think the important thing is to recognize that the questioning attitude needs to be allowed within the force, within a reasonable standard, and then also, in my opinion, that'll kind of force the discussion to a core of what can we do differently, and as we look at problems, to look to achieve an advantage over a future adversary.
Let me maybe ask the question a slightly different way, which is, what is the problem you think we are solving with innovation?
Ben, if it's all right with you, I'll go first. I think the problem we are looking to solve with innovation is, in my opinion, since the end of the Cold War, this is all, again, more from the U.S. military perspective. The U.S. military, the Department of Defense, has had a predilection to look at the world through the lens of an omnipotent superpower. through a great technological military advantage at the end of the Cold War, so the early 1990s, we have become very accustomed to operating in an environment where there's very little risk to our forces, and then there's very little risk of catastrophic military defeat at the hands of the adversaries we've been engaged with since the end of the Cold War. So I think as we kind of go forward and what we need to innovate and what we need to do is recognize, and the 2018 National Defense Strategy does this, as it mentions great power competition, is the fact that there's no longer an unchallenged technical superiority that the United States military forces have, and so we are looking to innovate to now, hopefully, as mentioned previously by Under Secretary Bob Work, achieve the third offset or achieve some sort of advantage to recognize the fact that we have lost ground to the adversary, and we need to look to be better able to deal with future conflict.
So would it be fair to summarize your view that the problem we are solving with innovation is complacency?
In my opinion, I think characterizing it as complacency is a little too strong. I think it's more lack of a challenge, which I know kind of breeds right into complacency. But I think the U.S. military has become accustomed to advantages it no longer has. And to me, when you say complacent, maybe I interpret it too much as a pejorative to go right along with complacent to lazy. And I don't see that what the U.S. military has done has been complacent/lazy.
So what are the advantages we no longer have?
We no longer have, in my opinion, an unchallenged technical advantage over future near-peer competitors and adversaries. And I think as we look to innovate, it would be what do we need to do as a force to hopefully achieve the future advantage.
Okay. Ben, how would you answer that?
Well, all armed forces, I agree completely with what Greg said, but my perspective is that all armed forces and defence organisations in peace need to be looking at keeping their cutting edge as sharp as they possibly can against their potential adversaries. So what you're trying to do is to gain that decisive advantage before the war or the conflict starts, and be in a position to then adapt as quickly as you can, as it inevitably turns out slightly different than you've imagined. Now, the problem in peace is that armed forces and defence ministries often display all the negative characteristics of a state-owned bureaucracy.
It's true.
And there are understandable reasons for that. And in addition, in peace, it'll often attract people who have peacetime bureaucratic characteristics.
The regulators, as Andrew Gordon calls it in Rules of the Game.
And he also calls the antithesis of them the people you need to win, the Rommels, the Pattons of this world. Rat catchers. I call them combat entrepreneurs. Absolutely no doubt that time and again you need that characteristic and that culture in your organisation. So part of what you're trying to do is get the organisation to behave more as if it's at war, and more as if it's actively searching for solutions and thinking of ways and means of doing things better. I don't agree with your one statement that complacency is a word too strong. I was the director of the Army Staff from 2001 to 2003 down the road in the MOD, and I can tell you, in the British Army, there was a warm glow of self-satisfaction because of the success of Desert Storm, of Bosnia, of Kosovo, of Sierra Leone and East Timor, and we're all a tad too pleased with ourselves. And it took actually reverses in Iraq and Afghanistan to shed that sense of complacency and create that burning platform. And armed forces and defence ministries need something in them that can puncture the armour of complacency. Different ways of doing it, of course.
Yeah. Shockey's theory of institutional dry rot is the frequency with which American secretaries of defense or senior military leaders talk about having the finest military in history. right? Like that, danger signals in neon lights ought to be going on over your head if you are saying that about your institution, because what you are conveying is precisely the kind of complacency that prevents innovation. One of my very favorite books about innovation is by Charles O'Reilly. He's the chair of institutional or organizational innovation at the Stanford Business School, and spends all of his time looking across hundreds and hundreds of companies to figure out how to answer the question, why is it so hard for successful organizations to innovate? And of course the answer is complacency, right? It's hard to say, we're on an oil rig in the middle of the ocean and it's on fire. Somebody figure out how to put this out. If you think you're good at your job, and successful organizations are good at their jobs. And so he studies, how do you keep a strain of that in your DNA as an organization is still successful? And I think that is the fundamental challenge that motivates the third offset, whatever that means, which is basically, oh my God, other people have technology, and which motivates the sense of, why didn't we anticipate in the year of our Lord 2003 that weaker adversaries were going to have asymmetric strategies, because that's what smart people do. Go.
Well, we do know the reasons in the case of the US Army, which was part of their rediscovery of their warfighting skills in the 1980s, was rejection of Vietnam. That was all a bit unpleasant. We don't want that sort of thing again. So counterinsurgency can be hived off to special operations forces, and the US Marine Corps was sort of allowed to keep it alive as part of their small wars.
Culture trumps doctrine 1,000% of the time.
Yeah.
Right? And because the American Army worried that the American public wouldn't fight a war like that, and ruled it off the table. Just as, by the way, the last two national defense strategies also say, we are not going to fight these kinds of wars anymore. So who innovates? I'm sorry, go ahead, Greg.
I also think part of that comes from the I know it's a pejorative, but the revolution in military affairs. So this American mindset, through greater technology, through more networked forces, we can achieve a reality that removes the fog from war, that we can fundamentally change the nature of war as opposed to just evolve the character of it. And then I think there's a lot also that goes into 2003 that mistakes kind of stemmed from that way of thinking, a lack of recognition of what the nature of war is throughout the force, failed to basically see that through the use of armed force you achieve a lot of second, third, fourth order effects that you never intended, and that when resorting to military force, you force an adversary to react, and they're going to react in a way that's best suited to them, and that is also least suited to you. And I think that's where, as we talk about like innovation, I think that's where we need to look at also holistically and philosophically the use of military force and military power, and go back to it may sound cliche, but some of the more erudite thinkers that we've used throughout the U.S. military in the 80s that then no longer became mentioned, which would obviously be like Clausewitz and Thucydides.
Yeah, that's not what we're doing here today. Let me ask you both: who innovates well?
On states, Israel and Sweden have very close coupling between their militaries, their defence industries, and their wider national talent. Now, that may be something to do with Israel being a national service country, and Sweden, until very recently, having had national service and bringing it back. There are some very innovative areas of the US military, for example, the Special Operations Forces, the US Marine Corps, who's smaller than the Army, which gives them a certain amount of agility. And then there's the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, who, because of its charter to experiment at cutting edge of technology, and also because it seems to have institutional permission to fail. But I think you've also got to look at non-state actors. Hamas, they have access to a sort of brains trust of experts from Gaza University, and they've constantly managed to seize the initiative from Israel. Recent examples: seizing a lead in tunnel warfare, And this recent initiative, sending firebombs over with kites and balloons improvised from condoms, has neatly outmaneuvered Iron Dome and Israel's layered air defence, as well as created a real moral hazard for the IDF. Lebanese Hezbollah, which at times has outfought Israeli forces, and there's a lot of open source reporting from the war in Syria that they've become the most effective combat forces on the ground there. And then Daesh. They outfought their opponents. They outfought them in Syria, they outfought them in Iraq. And how did they do it? They applied a flexible mixture of terrorism, insurgency, and conventional capabilities, and pulled the levers on those according to the situation. Want an example of this? They've been using drones since 2014, although a lot of Western military have proved to be rather surprised at the extensive use of drones they made in Mosul. And secondly, the example of suicide vehicle bombs to achieve the same effect as conventional armoured engineers, breaching obstacles and berms.
Excellent examples.
I think from my own personal experience within the United States Navy, innovation occurs when you get to a smaller group of empowered individuals, to go back to Ben's point, that are allowed to fail, that are empowered to break norms, and think of a creative solution to a problem that we have been unable to solve. And specifically, with my experience, that has been, as it relates to flying fighters for the Navy, would be Top Gun at Fallon. So you have a small group of relatively junior individuals who've been in the Navy for maybe 5 or 6 years. They're junior officers. But then for the United States Navy, if you were to ask a question of the United States Navy as it relates to the F-18 or a weapon we employ off that aircraft, the United States Navy's subject matter expert on that weapon, on that airplane, is a 30-year-old lieutenant in Fallon, Nevada. So it's empowering a smaller group and letting them know that overall the organization has their back, so they can go in the direction that they feel is most required to solve whatever tactical problem the fleet may be facing.
So I think two really important strains come out of both of your answers. One is this business about failure, and that is the single most important element in innovation, right? If you can treat failure as data rather than attaching normative or value or cultural penalties to it, you are dramatically more likely to find solutions to the problem. That I notice it, having spent a long time in Silicon Valley, that it's data, right? Like, I know venture capitalists who won't give money to a startup unless the leadership team has already run 2 or 3 things into the ground. Because what they are thinking is these are people who attach value to failure, and therefore they won't be innovative enough to make me money. So that's one thing that I thought I heard both of you say and feels really important. The second thing in particular came out of Greg's comments, but I trace it also to the innovation, particularly in Palestine, is that it doesn't matter who has an answer, right? And so you can't expect any organization that expects its leadership to produce the ideas or solutions is going to fail at innovation. Everybody has to be empowered to say, why are electrical plugs shaped that way, and why do we have an on and off switch to them? Everybody has to be encouraged to experiment, and the leadership's main function. I think about this when I think about Petraeus and the development of counterinsurgency too. It wasn't his idea. It was him saying, I want every sergeant on a patrol any place to tell me what works and what doesn't, and a better idea for doing it. That kind of limbering up of an organizational culture, and it tends to happen in combat because you have so many immediate problems to solve. And if everybody's a sensor, you get a lot better solutions. But I'm surprised at what didn't make your lists of who's good at innovation. You in particular only said the United States Navy's good at innovation, so I'm going to push you a little bit more on
in my experience, there was one very small part of the United States Navy that I believed had done well innovating.
Okay, but your expertise is not so narrow as the Navy. So look around the world. Who's good at changing the calculus?
Well, so I think this goes into how you talk about innovation as well. So I think everything there's an action, there's a counter reaction, and I think to go back to my earlier mention of kind of this post-Cold War era, complacency, laziness, whatever we may call it, failure to look at the world creatively and come up with solutions to it. The United States has been a power that. Our military force is, without challenge, excellent at projecting power globally. And so all of our adversaries now have reacted to that and are innovating their force structure, their concept of operations. And so that is their reaction to our action of being experts at power projection with a force-on-force conflict. So I think now we are at the beginning phases, I would hope, of the United States military's ability to execute our reaction to their reaction to what we have done.
So
the adversaries there being the great powers mentioned in the national defense strategy of Russia and China.
Okay. Ben, do you think Russia's any good at innovation?
Well, they have a rich tradition of it. People should be under no illusions. Successfully developing world-beating series of armoured vehicles and mastering the operational art in the second half of the Great Patriotic War. Yes, they put a big bet, for example, on missile-based anti-access and area denial systems, which is causing real problems for NATO in the Baltic and the Baltic states. But I think where you see it right now is Russian operations in Syria. The US and its allies are very pleased with the model of buy-through-with operations they've been doing in Iraq and Syria. But Russia's been doing buy-through-with much less background. Now, it's buy-through-with gone to the dark side, and it's linked to a much more ruthless approach to the use of air and artillery. But there's some really innovative stuff in there. For example, creating what they call a force reconciliation cell, an American term from Iraq, that actually reaches out to the various enclaves they're besieging and negotiates these surrenders where the fighters and their families are allowed to leave. Similarly, they've been really quite good at embedding their forces with the Syrian Arab army, integrating what they're doing with the Syrian troops on the ground, the Russian air power and missile power, Lebanese Hezbollah, and also Iran with its activities using the Iranian-raised Shia militia. Mm-hmm. And this is something I've been doing some research on, and if anybody of you have been working on it, I'd love to hear from you afterwards. But the Russians have far less background in doing this than, for example, the US and UK. Mm-hmm. But they've got a model which in some respects has worked better, and they come from behind.
Yeah, a more brutal but I think also illustrious example, the Russian willingness to use air power to bomb hospitals where Syrian casualties of government chemical weapons use are being treated. If you want to pick an ally, somebody would do that for you. As opposed to the delicacy with which the American military is saying, we can't give you shoulder-fired weapons because we don't actually really trust you.
And a quick plug, if I may, for the work we do in the Defence and Military Analysis Programme, because we've been tracking Russian and Chinese military modernisation now for a decade, but as both of them have gathered speed, we've devoted increasing analysis to this. And when you look at it, for example, in the chapter on China in the last Military Balance, you see them selectively adopting some very Western ways of doing things, which they seem to have gone through an evaluation process. Another example, the reorganisation of the Russian army on a brigade structure. Well, the chief of the General Staff Military Academy basically explained that what they've done is they've done a design exercise. They then created about a dozen brigades and put them through the year's training and exercise cycle, made some adjustments and just implemented it. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's exactly what armed forces should be doing anyway. But, you shouldn't underestimate that in the past the Russians have done this. Part of it in the Russian case is based on a very thorough programme of education for their officers, particularly the more senior the officers get, the more educated they get. Mm-hmm. And you see China, for example, adopting a very US approach to force-on-force exercises for their land forces.
So let me ask you, Greg, to talk a little bit about China. What do you see them doing that's interesting? What blind alleys can we drive them down in their innovation? Because it sounds like they're copying us.
In my opinion, their copying of us is an advantage, because as they do that, we're aware of the pluses and minuses, the goods and others associated with whatever weapon system, concept of operations, or force procurement strategy we have. An example being, I think, where they may be led down a blind alley is the manner in which they, so far, show every sign in being very eager to basically mimic the manner in which the United States Navy is focused on carrier strike groups. So there are a lot of pluses and minuses for that. It's, the world's most expensive complex weapon system, and if you can have your adversary start to invest an enormous amount of resources in the procurement, training, and maintenance of such a complex weapon system, also in an environment where...
Well, we moved to swarms of disposables.
Well, however, our carriers will still be around and maybe employing swarms of disposables, but where the Chinese will operate their aircraft carriers, I mean, for example, it's very easy to counter and put that ship at risk from a submarine. And then the Vietnamese purchase of their newest Kilo class subs, I can imagine no greater joy in any service than to be a Vietnamese sub captain to watch a Chinese carrier go down. Because with a carrier, it's not just a ship and it's not just the people aboard it, it's a capital ship, and there's the idea of the face of the nation on that ship. I don't know if anyone is in the room is familiar with when they started to shoot aircraft or launch aircraft off the Liaoning, and it became viral in mainland China to execute the shooter sign throughout the country. So, which, if you've seen Top Gun, is what the action that the personnel on board the flight deck that do to launch the aircraft. So the fact that the people have embraced this idea of we are now a great power and great nation based on being able to put a carrier to sea, I think is a great blind alley to lead them down. And because best case scenario, they don't execute all mission areas of a carrier strike group very well, and that leaves them at tremendous risk. And then also, if they do become masters in every single mission that a carrier strike group can perform, that is an enormous outlay of resources in a very finite area that we're very familiar with how to counter.
That's a nice point. One of my favorite innovators these days is the Japanese military, because constrained by a public that doesn't want to be a major military power, and a threat portfolio that's getting a lot scarier given North Korean and Chinese behavior. The Japanese are selling ships and submarines and equipment and giving training to all of their neighbors. The Philippines, they're teaching how to do broad area surveillance of Chinese shipping, civilian and military. They are basically constrained as they are by a public that will not let them do what they think is necessary for their defense. They're actually creating proxies who share their political objective and arming and training them up to a level where they are going to be able to carry out missions the Japanese can't carry out themselves. Strikes me as a very smart innovation to get around a tightly constrained box. So I want to hear from the folks around the table before I move on to my next set of questions. Who do you think are good innovators and why? I'm looking at you, Nick.
I'm going to provide a rather airy-fairy answer to that, in the sense that I think, and you alluded to it at the beginning to some respect, that for defence as a whole, globally, the big issue is actually where innovation is most embedded and being most successful is outside the defence world.
Right.
So those in the defence sector who are the best innovators are those who are finding the way to capture that holy grail of leveraging that innovation. And a large part of that is having to overcome issues around cultural, hierarchical elements of military structure that work against that, such that the greatest crime is to lose what you have already hold, and attempts to change course are looked at as very much in the political, cultural context of a zero-sum game, that what I give up, somebody else will be able to take advantage of, so I'll just hold on to what I've got. So, and in that context, in some ways the key to innovation is having decisions forced on you from outside, and going back in naval terms, and UK naval terms, the Royal Navy was forced to innovate essentially a new fleet structure when their toys of the previous generation, the big aircraft carriers, were taken away from them. And so they had to innovate a new force structure around mini aircraft carriers, and they had completely rejected the idea of small aircraft carriers with jump jet planes on board because they felt the performance wasn't good enough. And they turned that performance in the end into a war-winning capability in the Falklands. But that was forced on them. How you create that forcing effect, I think, is important. That was interesting what Greg was saying about China and China's investment in aircraft carriers. It'd be interesting to know how far they are going to invest in aircraft carriers, because yes, there is a bit of a sense in which, actually, surprisingly, there are elements that they are forcing the West to innovate in terms of the anti-access area denial capability, and yet they are investing in aircraft carriers, and maybe, we've got them. But maybe they're investing in aircraft carriers to an extent such that, the camp in the US Navy that says aircraft carriers are a thing of the past are defeated by the carrier lobby saying that the Chinese, who are the most challenging in terms of questions around aircraft carriers, are investing in aircraft carriers themselves. So we're right to be spending another $12 billion per copy of aircraft carrier in the Ford class, because the Chinese are doing it as well. So we must all be onto the right thing. So it could, who knows? It could be a double bluff. It's a very expensive double bluff. But I'm guessing even the third, fourth, and fifth aircraft carriers the Chinese build are not going to be a fraction of the cost of what the Ford class is.
Yeah, so when the United States loses its next war, the first traitors going in front of the firing squad are everybody involved in the acquisition process.
Exactly.
Because that is what is silted up. It is the biggest enemy of innovation.
Absolutely. Where is the bottleneck? It is in the acquisition process. It is understanding that innovation is not a point you arrive at. It's a process, and that process involves having to be able to get ahead of everyone else's innovative change.
Yeah.
And we just I was down at Farnborough earlier this week, and we had the unveiling of the new UK combat air strategy, which was described as a paradigm shift in the approach to innovation.
Oh, good Lord.
And actually what that has involved is then saying that actually our next aircraft, combat aircraft, we will develop in 17 years, not 25. But it's not exactly a paradigm shift.
Right.
So, it's an acknowledgement of something needs to change, but the answer is still not there.
So one of my favorite examples that Charles O'Reilly uses in his book is Lieutenant Sims forcing the adoption of continuous aim gunfire. Right? So it used to be the case that excellence in naval leadership was positioning the ship so the guns could hit something. Right? So a cannon could hit something. Somebody thought, wow, if we put them on stabilizers, that would actually create a 350% increase in accuracy. And both the Royal Navy and the American Navy rejected it when the opportunity was brought to them, because the Bureau of Ordnance in both places didn't like how disruptive this would be, and the leadership couldn't figure out what do captains at sea actually have to do if maneuvering a ship is no longer the point of this. And it takes a terminal lieutenant who had political connections to the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who was then the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, to catapult over the institutional opposition. And very often, like now in the United States, Bob Work, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, had this breathless hand-waving notion that sounded a lot like GIFCOM circa 2001, that a third offset of magic glitter on a unicorn horn is going to, instead of the hard work of everybody's a censor, everybody experiments, you've got to stop punishing people who come up with ideas that shake the cage of what you think the purpose of the endeavor is.
Well, and that's why I think it's very easy and proper to attack the acquisition process as flawed and just slow to the point of, in my opinion, almost hyperbole. But to the left of that earlier is culture. And I think if you have a risk-averse culture, then even with an incredibly agile or nimble acquisition system, you are not going to acquire, develop, etc., any weapon system that is going to pose a risk to existing force structures. So I think for me it starts at culture. And do you have a risk do you have a culture that rewards risk takers, or at a minimum incentivizes taking risk?
So my favorite article ever written about military innovation was written by a Navy lieutenant commander circa 1997 or so in Joint Forces Quarterly, and it was on the subject of how Lieutenant Nimitz would never survive in today's Navy. Chester Nimitz was court-martialed as a lieutenant, and the court-martial concluded that he was actually, playing around with some interesting stuff, and we wanted more of that amongst lieutenants in the Navy, and so they kept him, and he goes on to be the admiral that wins the war in the Pacific in World War II. That making a distinction between who is unprofessional and dangerous versus who do we let into the space of trying to flip all the tables over is actually a really hard cultural choice, a leadership one. For those of you who haven't read Ben Horowitz's great book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, he was the founding CEO of Netscape, one of the early internet browsers. And Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital company, only gives money to founder-run startups. So they're unique in Silicon Valley in that regard. And because they believe it is easier to teach an inexperienced leadership team how to run a company than it is to teach a leadership team a revolutionary idea. And this book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, comes out of a series of blog posts he had done to try and teach how to lead an innovative organization to these 23-year-olds, never had a job before, engineers, who, when they're feeling really incredibly gregarious, talk to your shoes instead of their own shoes about how to lead a team. And in one part of it, he talks about a challenge he faced as the head of Netscape, where the most valuable engineers in the organization were behaving in a way that made other people in the organization uncomfortable. And other people in the organization complained about it. And he had to decide what to do. And I think about that example when I think about the military all the time, because the choice he made was to keep the best engineers and fire the people who complained about organizational culture. And I cannot imagine the American Army doing that. And maybe they shouldn't, but we don't even have a conversation about should or shouldn't on that. Yes, sir?
Yeah, John Smeller, Labour Member of Parliament, Vice Chair of the Defence Committee. Well, Lord Raglan was a risk centre as well, but it's probably not, after the Charter of the Right Brigade, a role model. And therefore it is about managed risk.
Yes.
And one of the questions that's involved in that is why, in particularly, say, take the UK, are they so bad and dilatory in normal acquisition, but actually urgent operational acquisition, they're extremely good. And you can see that, for example, in the Falklands, where having a British industry, which they were able to work with very quickly, back to Ben's point about, say, Sweden, they were able to innovate incredibly quickly. But there is a danger here, I think, that we're comparing apples and pears, because you have a military, unless we're going to have competing militaries, unless we're going to have privately raised regiments, and the one that does best procures best will shut down the others. None of these are likely scenarios. And so, therefore, we're not able to have those disciplines of its essence that work in the private sector, which fundamentally is bankruptcy. Because many of these bright, witty kids in Silicon Valley go bust with their ideas of rubbish. And several of them don't ever come up with a good idea, and they burn quite a bit of capital.
It's very often that people in government say, but we can't afford to fail. And the honest answer is, you guys fail all the time.
But that's the essence of it all, because the constraints are greater. We have a procurement process imposed particularly by treasuries, but also by legislators and also by public opinion, who require huge degrees of transparency and great degrees of process.
Absolutely. Would either of you like...
That applies right the way across government. Not just with regard to the military. There may well be strong arguments for tackling that. But otherwise, we're going to be dealing with the symptom, which we happen to see accentuated in the military, as opposed to the primary cause here.
It's an excellent point. And before I let Ben answer it, let me say how we get around it in the United States by competition internal to the organization. We don't have one army, we have two armies, the Marine Corps and the Army, and then we have Special Operations Forces, who are insidious usurpers of what both of those institutions try and do institutionally. So there are ways around it. You also, as you pointed out, we are reasonably good at urgent off-books procurement, right? All the stuff you need for Afghanistan or up-armored Humvees, but only if the leadership absolutely forces it, makes all manner of tawdry drug deals with the Congress to get around funding cycles and things like that. But you wanted to weigh in on this.
It really helps if the military concern has a prime enemy and a war plan. And two of the most fantastic examples of innovation are the US Army between the two World Wars and the US Marine Corps. Because on the basis of planning for a war across the Pacific with Japan, they worked out what they needed, experimented with it on exercises, thought through the doctrine, and had it ready to go in 1941. And that created the tools that Nimitz was able to use. And I would hope within the UK and NATO countries that now, having identified NATO in a Russia scenario as the prime driver, they're able to focus on that much more than they might have been in the last decade. No one should have any illusions. Defence procurement of complex, expensive weapon systems is difficult. A lot of countries have far worse records than the UK. Or you get affluent countries where they default to buying what the Chief of the Air Force or the Chief of the Army fancies. However, there are, from time to time, real world-beating weapon systems that sell on their merits and their value for money. I mean, right now, the Leopard 2 tank, the M777 howitzer, the Harrier jump jet. So there is some trick about getting it right, which I'm not sure I understand enough. What I think has changed now is there's fantastic new tools to try out new ways and means. Take an example, the development of armoured warfare in Germany between the two world wars. A lot of the exercises had cardboard tanks on bicycles and wooden anti-tank guns, for example, but they developed the winning formula of the blitzkrieg. You don't have to do that now, because you can go into a synthetic environment which can be quite large, in which you can have real operators playing around with new ideas. And that will enable you to decide which are the poor ideas that you can reject. And what you can also do with weapon effects simulators, such as are used by the US at their National Training Centre or the British Army in Canada, is you can then take that idea and you can have a mock-up on the battlefield doing what it would do as a battlefield on the battlefield. So, a respectable idea that's around right now is it wouldn't be too difficult to have completely unmanned armoured vehicles that were either remotely operated or indeed in time could have their own AI on board. Well, that can be tried in a synthetic environment now, and actually it wouldn't be too difficult to then have mock-ups at the National Training Centre or the British facility in Canada. And I think if you were able to bring forward people like Nimitz and Guderian and sit them down and show them what this technology can do, and do very cheaply, because most of the R&D is being done by the civilian gaming industry, they'd say, wow, why aren't you making much more use of this?
So I'm reminded with your point about if only we pulled forward the Guderians and the Nimitzes, is that it's very hard to know who they are, right? Woolworth, the founder of the department stores in the United States, famously said that 50% of the money he spent on advertising was wasted. If only he could figure out which 50% got wasted. Right? And that's the hard part, because it's art and artistry as much. And you're wrong a lot. If you think about what made the American Army so innovative going into World War II, I would suggest two things. One, the blunt force trauma ruthlessness of the Chief of Staff of the Army cashiering 35% of the officer corps after the Louisiana maneuvers, when he figured out who's nimble enough to address new challenges. Right? George Marshall cashiers 35% of the officer corps of the Army. So we talk about Stalin killing all his generals right before. Marshall kind of goes through the same culling process. The second thing that makes the American Army really innovative is getting our claw cleaned in North Africa. That it was the loss that created the trade. Everybody thought they knew what they were doing until they realized they didn't know what they were doing.
And I think that brings up, to me, a very important distinction. So to use the analogy for the acquisition system. So acquisition in peacetime is this ponderous just dinosaur that meanders down the road, and eventually 25 to 30 years later produces some exquisite platform. And it costs, the costs soar, and it's something everyone does very well to write about and to critique. Because there isn't a very defined need, where you go to the example of, like, in combat, there is a very defined failure point. We have lost X amount of lives, X amount of vehicles based on threat X. So it's a very clear defined need. So then that becomes the weapon by which a leadership can then bludgeon the subordinates with, here's why you need to reform your acquisition process, because of X amount of people have already died and X amount of people are currently at risk from violent death due to your inability to push this program through. So I think the problem becomes, how do you develop that impetus in peacetime where you don't have that drive? You don't have the U.S. Army losses in North Africa. You don't have the U.S. Navy losses initially in the Pacific in World War II that became like, well, clearly you failed in the crucible of combat. You're fired, you're cashiered, and now we're going to bring up the next layer that have proven in combat that they were successful and had that fluidity of thought. So how do you draw that line to pick out in peacetime those people that are going to be able to innovate, that are going to say no to the organization, that are going to drive it in a different direction? And then also, they don't have anything to stand on. In my opinion, like as an 05 in the Navy, I can shake my fist at the sun and tell you all the things that the Navy needs to do better, or the U.S. military, or whatever. But other than me backing up my opinion through, well, I've read this and I saw this and did the other thing, you don't have in the military that weight of, like, if it's in peacetime, am I a flag officer? Because, it's a very hierarchical organization. Or if it's in wartime, because of your failure to do these following things, my unit sustained X amount of losses. And I think, how do you generate that force in peacetime to actually produce innovation is very difficult. And I think that's where the analogy between the civilian world and the Department of Defense breaks down just a little bit, because we want to empower failure, then empowering failure in the military, which is something we should do more of, also does cost lives.
Admiral Richardson, the Chief of the Navy, was in this house a few weeks ago, and when asked what his biggest, if he could only change one thing, like, what are you most worried about? If you could only change one thing, what was it? It was to impart a greater sense of urgency. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so Lieutenant Colonel McDonald, I'm the U.S. Army attaché here in London now, until the end of the day. So we mentioned the U.S. Army quite a bit, and so I'm kind of interested in their reaction to something I'll just talk about a little bit. And it is innovation. We seem to be talking a lot about innovation in the sense of technological gain, but also process. But I think we tend to be shifting more towards capability. Wanted to talk a little bit about an old institution. So we have Training and Doctrine Command, which is not just training and not just doctrine, but is actually the architect of the Army and is charged with seeing out into the future, experimenting, developing concepts, and then it also is responsible for running our battle labs, which essentially are combat training centers, where we put brigade formations of 4,000 or 5,000 people, force on force against whatever we want to do, whether that's counterinsurgency or whether that's a pure adversary or even a pure plus adversary. We use these to push people to failure.
What's the best example of a big concept the Army tried there and failed with?
Couldn't answer that question, but I'll get back to you.
I can answer that.
However, I will tell you that no brigade combat team goes to a training environment and comes out as a victor. They always go, they always fail. And what makes the system work well, and I think it's a good one to export, is there's an after-action review mentality that was created with the establishment of Training and Doctrine Command back in 1973. But you won't find any Army activity without, at the end, an after-action review. What happened? Why did it happen? How can we do it better? What was your thinking as you went through the decisions that you took during that, whatever that activity was?
I would so love to see the Army impose that brilliant system on its own acquisition decisions.
Guess what? So we've decided that we are very, very unsatisfied in the case of innovation, and so we're going to stand up, as you know now, the Army Futures Command, which is designed to compress good idea to real capability being the whole spectrum of things, doctrine, organization, leadership, facilities, and all. But it's going to do that, and it's going to do that and focus in 6 key areas where we're going to take people who are stovepiped now and jam them under a brigadier general and try to force ourselves into a compressed good idea to outcome around a year or so.
I earnestly, desperately, passionately hope it works, because the Army has been being out-innovated by our adversaries for almost 30 years now, and our margin of error is thinning. Anybody else on the subject of innovation before I go back to money? Go. Tell us who you are, please.
I'm sorry, it's Simon Cook. I work on UK-US relations in the MOD. Part of the issue with testing and using simulators and things is you need an innovative person to think of the problems. Too often I think we test our things against the things we assume we're going to come up against.
That's a great point.
So I think that's quite.
Absolutely. Go.
There's absolutely no doubt that the creation of TRADOC and the force-on-force training centres for the US Army got it match fit for the Cold War, and you saw it play to those strengths that had been developed in Operation Desert Storm. Victory, of course, can be the mother of complacency. But you specifically asked an example of an idea they seriously tried out and didn't use. One of those early 80 initiatives was light divisions. The US Army felt it had really good heavy force, it had light intervention force like the 82nd 101st Airborne, but it didn't really, its light divisions were a bit low tech. So the big idea was, could you have a light division size force that required even less strategic airlift but could still pack a punch on a mid-intensity battlefield? And there was an experimental light division, I think it was the 9th Division, set up in Fort Lewis, and they tried out all sorts of new ideas, including having whole battalions whizzing around with dune buggies with heavy weapons on. But at the end they came to the conclusion that it wouldn't have decisive advantage, and if it was to stand and fight against an enemy of any significance, it would need so much heavy additional enablers that it just wasn't worth it. But that's a good example of the whole cycle.
It's a fabulous example.
And it's all there. But just one point on the value of the training centres. I mean, it is battalions that go through them, I think, still have 8 missions. There's only one battalion ever that succeeded at all 8 missions. In fact, I noticed recently someone's published a book on it to try and draw enduring lessons. And the thing you can do now also is you can now generate real hard data from all these and use them for all sorts of purposes. Mm-hmm. And the other application of this technology is you can do higher level now, very credible war games. You know, you could fight a NATO versus Russia war in the Baltics in virtual reality and come up with interesting conclusions. And I'm absolutely certain that people in the UK and US have been doing this, but at high security classification levels. And if that then doesn't provide the evidence that people need to see where they need to do better, well, there's people not doing their jobs.
So you raised the point earlier in a Top Gun context too about the rigor of an abrasive actor-action process that is uninterested in what was done well and puts a lot of pressure on how do we think about what we did badly, what were other decisions we could have made at that point in time, what are tools we need that we don't have to succeed at this. That matters hugely. It's often said that the American way of war is technology. And I always bristle at that because we're even worse than that suggests. The American way of war is mostly overwhelming a problem with resources, right? 10,000 soldiers a day into World War I by the summer of 1919. It's, an aircraft built every 49 seconds during World War II. And I wonder whether you guys think, and then the third example, which was during the Bush administration when we were trying to push innovation faster through the American military. I was still new as the director for defense strategy, and so not smart enough to ask a really sharp question. We made all the services grade what proportion of their budget is cutting edge, right, is transformational. Anybody care to guess what the United States Air Force's answer to that question was?
100%.
They scored 100% of their budget as truly cutting edge. And I realized it was a really stupid question. The right question to ask is, what can you stop spending money on because you have succeeded in innovation? So I'd love for you guys to answer two questions. First is throwing money at the problem of innovation useful for the British and American militaries now? It seems to me there are points in time where it's helpful, there are points in times where it can be a hindrance. Is it helpful or hurtful now to fight the American way of war of just dumping buckets full of money at this and see what it produces? Right? DARPA's just made wheels that turn into tank tracks and back. If you haven't seen the video, it's super spiffy. Is that where we are, or should we make a series of choices that starve current processes and therefore create the kind of external constraints that require new and better ways of doing stuff? What would you do?
I would, first off, to answer your question, in my opinion, is money or abundance or adequate level of resources a hindrance to innovation? And I would say in a peacetime force, it is a hindrance. Because in a peacetime force, your level of resourcing becomes your forcing function. If you do not have adequate resources as previously described based on what you're looking to achieve for goals, etc., then you're going to look to ways to do things better and more efficient to achieve your desired end. You may even back off even more of the problem and say, what can we do holistically to completely relook at what we're doing, and is there a better way to do it? So I think being adequately resourced is, in essence, in general, would tend to be a hindrance to innovation within the military, because it removes the impetus for really kind of digging into a problem and thinking, are we doing this the right way?
Okay, Ben?
The answer to your two explicit questions, Corey, is yes to both.
Excellent. Bonus for succinctness. So our time is growing short, my friends. I would love to hear additional objections, statements, questions you have for our two experts on this. Familial complaints. We'll take it all on board. Anybody have anything you want us all to understand?
My name is Gregory P from GSCM, Wing-based Innovation Office. How do you compare UK-US innovation to other countries like Russia, for example, and how do you consider that with respect to cyber warfare?
Fabulous question. Ben?
Well, they are doing innovation. They're doing innovation on different things. But one thing about Russia and China is they didn't get slightly diverted from warfighting towards a decade of counterinsurgency.
Counterinsurgency is warfighting.
They've kept. You're absolutely right, Corey. But it's not necessarily the same sort of warfighting you need for conflicts in Eastern Europe or indeed around the South China Sea. So they've been able to continue to invest resources, for example, in anti-access area denial. But one thing about the US and British Armed Forces is they have now got generations of people who've been proven in combat.
That's a nice point.
And know something about fighting. And I suspect there's enormous innovation and adaptation going on in the cyber world. Indeed, cyber criminals have proved immensely good at this. Much of it, because it tended to sit with national signals agencies, is necessarily classified.
I think overall to your question, it's a great question, and if I were to grade US/UK innovation specifically regarding cyber to the Russians, in my opinion, we're under-innovating compared to the adversary. I think we don't have a way of looking at the use of that as a weapon. I don't think we have in the United States military necessarily right now yet the options via like U.S. code to do the type of actions that the Russian government is alleged to have taken. So I think we are behind right now in the innovation curve, in my opinion.
But is that about investment or about adoption?
Why does it have to be one or the other? It can be about both. One, it would be money, sure. So investment there, but your doctrine gets batted around like as a dirty word. Like if your doctrine can be one page and it can be just do it. And so if that's your doctrine, then your doctrine's not limiting you. If your doctrine is 4 feet of instructions delineating you will ask for permission at all these levels, then sure, that doctrine is a hindrance.
So I'm super happy to hear both of these answers about the deficiency, because my favorite article ever written on American foreign policy is by the journalist James Fallows. It was in the Atlantic magazine about 2006 when he came back from Beijing, being posted there as the correspondent, and it's about the role of the Jeremiah in American foreign policy, right? Book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah from Torah always fears he is failing God, and that's why he is beloved of God. And I feel like that's innovation. And if these guys are worried we don't have it going on, the Russians are better than us, I'm deeply skeptical that the Russians, for reasons financial, technological, cultural, are actually out-innovating us. Turkey shot down a Russian airplane. I'm not sure their doctrine's got it going on. But that we think we are failing at it is actually the most comforting thing I could hear about this, because that means every good strategist is a desperate paranoiac. And I feel like both the British and American militaries are beginning to get to that place where they're really scared that other people, we're electing not to innovate in several important ways. And there are asymmetric advantages to adversaries willing to innovate in ways we won't. Whether that is not letting our procurement systems hinder the kind of innovation we want to see, or whether it's, to take the AI example, we are going to put a set of restrictions on whose data can be collected and used as a database and on how it has to be used, that our adversaries are not going to put on their usage. And that creates asymmetric vulnerabilities for us. Entirely properly, in my judgment, but we need to think through what are the war-fighting consequences of these asymmetries. And I think we're only at the start of that process. We are ginning up here at the IISS a big study of those kinds of value-driven asymmetries as you catapult forward into artificial intelligence and assisted decision making. So if anybody's interested, we'd love to have you involved in it. Any other concerns, comments, objections, last words? Yes, sir.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on my colleague's comment here about...
Tell us who you are and what you do.
Michael Italia. I'm a student at master's student at Georgetown University. And I was thinking about what you said, that who's thinking about the other threats. And I also don't have a military background, so I might be like the 23-year-old engineer who doesn't know anything.
Or me, who also doesn't have a military background.
Okay, so I was thinking about two things which, well, first of all, we talked a lot about technology. And the two things I was thinking about were stability operations and ungoverned spaces. And in DC, you hear a lot of people in the military say, you know, all these politicians are asking us to do something that it's not really what we're trained for, it's not really our mission. How are we supposed to set up, you know, some kind of local council, governance council, etc.? So that's one question, and that's, last year in class, we looked at the AFRICOM strategy, and I think out of 11 missions, 10 of them were stability or governance related.
Yeah.
And the second thing is information warfare, and just thinking about how these concepts like democracy, rule of law, I think we're used to thinking that those are taken for granted, that most people around the world probably value that. And, you know, that's not necessarily the case anymore.
That's a testable hypothesis that we are choosing not to test.
Yeah. So those are just two thoughts that are not related to AI and tech and Silicon Valley.
Yeah, no, the limberness of your approach to a problem matters hugely. My favorite example of that was during the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, where the United Nations and most European NATO members believed that the delivery of humanitarian assistance was a neutral act, when in fact you are breaking the siege on a population that is allowing them to continue to fight. It's a weapon of war, and we really struggle to limber our minds up enough to figure out, why isn't this playing out the way we think it should be playing out? Last words? Words of wisdom that all of us should gather to on innovation? Anybody want to sum it up? Okay, you are left to your own devices. My friends, thank you for coming and enriching this conversation. It means a lot because we live on your good work.